Welcome to the full SAT English review. This is the only video you'll need to study for the English portion of the SAT. I'm going to break down all 13 question types that the College Board could possibly throw at you. We'll move through the four big domains: information and ideas, craft and structure, expression of ideas, and standard English conventions. And don't worry, I'll be walking you through strategies, tips, and explanations step by step. Plus, there will be practice questions for every single type, so you can test yourself along the way. Let's get started. We're going to begin with information and ideas. The first question is called command of evidence, and there's three types: textual scientific, textual literary, and quantitative. We're first going to focus on the scientific evidence question. It's going to look like this: which finding, if true, supports or refutes the researcher's claim? You're going to be given a passage about a science-related topic. It's often going to be biology. You will not need any sort of prior knowledge about biology or earth science or whatever they throw at you. You'll be given answer choices with various facts or false facts. In other words, one of those things is true and will help support or refute the claim that the researchers make in the passage. So you'll have a simple strategy for this. You're going to identify the claim or the hypothesis that the researchers make. Then you're going to simplify it. You're going to write it down in your own words using the scrap paper that they will provide on test day. You're then going to read the answer choices and then read the background of the science if necessary. Then you're going to keep repeating this process until you figure out the answer. Oftentimes, it will only take one run through if you use this strategy. And remember, we're now going to transition into doing a practice question for this type of question, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Take a second to see if you can answer this question yourself. Hopefully you've paused the video and you have your answer ready. Now I'm going to go through the correct answer. So, which finding, if true, would most directly support the team's conclusion, where they concluded that the presence of certain microbes in the soil might explain the difference between healthy and diseased plants? So, using our strategies, we can simplify this to just say that microbes in soil is related to difference between healthy and diseased plants. And the answer that best correlates with that is A. Why? Because this one says that the soil surrounding healthy plants has more microbes, has a different amount of microbes than the soil surrounding diseased plants, therefore indicating that the microbes have something to do with the amount of disease present in the concentration of plants in that area. Okay, our second type of question goes: which quotation most effectively illustrates the claim? So you're going to be given a passage. It introduces a text, its genre, and the author. So we're looking at literary evidence here. We're backing away from science. It'll have a claim that regards a person, a place, or an idea, a noun, within the novel. There will be several quotations as your answer choices, and one of those quotations will prove the claim that was made in the passage. Your strategy is the exact same. You're going to identify the hypothesis or the claim at hand, simplify it to read it in your own words, and then read the answer choices and the background if necessary. In this type of question, the background may help a lot because it'll tell you if a passage was, for example, written in the 1800s or the 1900s, and it'll help you understand the cultural and social norms of that time. Now, moving on to a practice question. 2. Command of evidence, textual, literary. Again, take a few seconds to see if you can answer this one on your own. Okay, so this question asks, which quotation from The Land of Enchantment most effectively illustrates the claim, where the claim is that Whiting reflects on the escape from everyday life that such a journey provides? Well, the best answer here is going to be D. Why D? Well, D almost exactly restates this claim, and that's a common theme in a lot of these quotation questions, right? She literally says that there's a certain detachment or an escape from ordinary day, otherwise known as everyday life, that is exhilarating, right? She finds that this escape from everyday life is exhilarating, right? She is reflecting on that. It's literally word for word, just copying what the description, what the claim says. This is our final command of evidence question. It focuses on quantitative data, that is data with numbers. So, question type 3 asks, which choice most effectively uses data from the graph or the table to prove the claim? And that also may read to disprove the claim. So you're going to be given a passage. It's going to usually introduce a scientific idea. It'll have a hypothesis that's derived from some research, and you might ask, where am I going to get that research? Well, you'll also be given a graph or a table with data, with research, that will prove or disprove the hypothesis made by the researchers or by the people who made the hypothesis. So your strategy is again pretty similar. You're going to identify the hypothesis contained in the passage. You're going to rewrite that in your own words as with the other two COE questions. Then you're going to find some data in the graph or the table that might prove that hypothesis. And you're then going to read the answer choices and then read the background. Now note, when you read the answer choices, some might falsely represent the data given. For instance, if I had a passage that was talking about the age of dinosaurs, and then one of the answer choices talked about something completely different. Let's say how long ago dinosaurs lived. That question choice you can eliminate immediately. You're going to complete this process as many times as it takes to answer the question. Usually, again, you will only need to use the strategy once. If you find yourself confused, just keep rereading the background and eventually, I promise it will click. So now we're going to move on to a practice question where I'm going to demonstrate this strategy. Now let's take a look at question type 3, command of evidence quantitative. Take a second, see if you can answer this yourself. So which choice most effectively uses data from the table to support Probst and colleagues' conclusion? Well, Probst and colleagues are concluding that the hypothesis up here is incorrect. So we want to find a counterexample to this right here. And that is going to be answer choice D. Why D? Well, it's showing here that one of the largest mean bill surface area and the habitat with the lowest temperature occurs. Additionally, with the second smallest mean bill area, we have the highest mean temperature. These are counterexamples because they show pretty clearly that when we have a low surface area, we have a high temperature. And when we have a high surface area, we have a low temperature. That is the opposite of what's going on up here. Our next question type is called central ideas, and you're going to be asked a pretty self-explanatory question: which choice best describes the main idea of the text? You're going to be given a passage that will either introduce an idea or a concept, or it'll be an excerpt from a poem or an Old English text. You're going to identify which type of text is provided first. If it's the former, if it's a passage introducing some sort of idea or concept or something about some specific topic, what you're going to do is you're going to first read the answer choices and eliminate obviously incorrect options, right? After you've read that text through, you should be able to see, this answer choice is completely wrong. You just eliminate those ones first because often in these type of questions, there are a lot of those. Then you're going to write out a basic structure in your own words of what that passage discussed. You're going to be like, okay, so first they had a claim, then they had some details, and then they had a new development. Something like that. Just write that down in some specific words on your own paper, then reread the answer choices and see which one best matches up with the outline that you yourself drew. Now, if it's the other type, if it's an excerpt from a poem or an Old English text, there's probably going to be some sort of main message, some sort of thematic idea, similar to what you might have on like a Common App essay or something about a life lesson, right? You're going to determine the main message that the poem or the Old English text attempts to impart. The most obvious solution is likely the right one. The SAT is not trying to do any sort of trickery or any advanced language analysis. They're just trying to test, can you figure out what the main idea of a pretty basic text is? All right, question type 4. Which choice best states the main idea of the text? Take a second again and see if you can solve this one on your own. Well, our answer here is going to be B. Why B? Well, let's take a look at this again. We have a pretty general structure here that we can solve using the outline strategy. So first we have kind of this hypothesis here, but it hasn't been tested. And then we have this guy, Sahas Barve, who studies feathers from songbird species to see if this hypothesis can be proved. And he does. He lends new support to the general prediction after finding an association between habitat temperature and feather structure. Therefore, B is the correct answer. Now, if I were to answer one of these guys, you could just see pretty clearly that if I were to make an outline, if I were to write it down like I would on the real SAT exam, these would just simply be incorrect. Our next question type is called details. According to the text, why is XYZ true, where XYZ is just some fact. Now, this one is a little bit harder to categorize, and it might be a little bit different of a structure. But basically, what this type of question is it's going to say, why is something about the text true or false, or how can I compare two things within the text? It'll just ask you about something within an excerpt. And again, we're going to have a passage that introduces some sort of idea or concept or topic, or you'll have a literary excerpt. And regardless of which one it is, the first thing you need to do is identify XYZ within the text. So if I'm having a text that is about blue whales or something, right, I'm going to identify where the text talks about blue whales and what about them I might need to answer the question. I'm going to underline that or highlight that on the exam. Then I'm going to reread the sentences that precede, that go before XYZ, because they're going to provide us with some valuable context, some valuable information. And then I'm going to read the answer choices. All right, because those sentences that precede XYZ are probably going to explain why it's true or more about it. And then with that information, I'll be able to read the answer choices and get the correct answer. Moving on to a practice question. Question type 5, details. Take a second and see if you can do this one on your own. Well, this one's a pretty easy one, and it's very clearly A. It literally says right here that Smilonskil, if that's how you pronounce it, is said to have ruled in the 10th century, but whose historical actuality is disputed. However, this guy up here, Lambert, is pretty clearly documented, right? They agree that this guy exists, but they're not really sure if this guy really exists or if he's maybe some sort of ancient urban legend. Our last information and ideas question type is called inferences. Which choice most logically completes the text? You'll be given 1 to 2 sentences with a passage with background information on a topic. Then you'll have some sort of hypothesis or a new finding or some fact that will be presented to you. And then a last sentence which will depend on that fact, which will end with a blank. So here's your strategy for this one. You're going to identify what the hypothesis or new findings or main argument of the text is. You're going to write that in your own words. Then you're going to analyze the answer choices to see which one best aligns with the hypothesis that's been presented. You're going to eliminate ones that are pretty obviously wrong, and then you're going to reread as necessary. A lot of the times that last blank is going to completely depend on the sentence that comes before it. Okay, so you need to make sure that whatever comes there makes sense and basically kind of proves the sentence before it. If the word therefore is present in that last sentence, then again, that's another sign that the answer choice is dependent on the preceding sentence. So with this last practice question, we're going to round out our discussion of information and ideas. Let's take a look at question type 6. Which choice most logically completes the text? Take a second and see if you can solve this on your own. The answer here is going to be C. Why? Because this sentence here says that a group of researchers recently reviewed hundreds of food-related paintings and found that lemons were in Dutch paintings 3 times more frequently as dairy periods did, therefore saying that food in Dutch paintings is not realistic, right? We see here that there's doubt on the idea that this is a realistic thing. This makes sense, right? We're literally seeing here that the art shows that there is a lot more lemons, whereas realistically, there were a lot less lemons, right? We have this kind of parallel here between doubt and realism. Now we're moving on to craft and structure. The first craft and structure question is called words in context, and this might as well be called the vocabulary question. It's going to ask which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase. You're going to be given a passage with information on a topic containing a blank in which a word should be inserted. So what they're basically going to do is they're going to give you a full passage. It'll be around 3 or 4 sentences, and there's just going to be a 1-word blank, and you're going to have to figure out which word is best suited to go into that blank. That's going to often depend on the context of the paragraph, and they're often going to repeat the same idea once or twice so you can get an idea of which word is best. So here's your strategy. You're going to identify some words that have been repeated once or twice within that paragraph, and you're going to note, hang on, this sentence almost means the exact same thing or very close to the sentence before it or the sentence after it. So therefore, I'm looking for similar words in both of these sentences. Those descriptive words are going to reveal the intended meaning of the word that you need to find. Next, you're going to fill in the blank with a word that you think works well. And you might not even look at the answer choices at this point. You might just think, I think that the word because would go really well here. Or I think that the word white would go well here. Or I think that the word rich or poor or whatever, right? You're going to then analyze the answer choices, see if the word that you put in the blank by yourself looks and correlates with some of those words that are in the answer choices. So let's say I said the word rich, and then one of the answer choices was the word wealthy. Well, that's probably the answer, right? Now, if you don't know a word, which is going to happen, especially in the hard modules, but you can eliminate words that you do know, use roots, use Latin roots to ascertain the correct answer. For example, if I have a word that starts with non, that probably is going to mean not, right? That word is going to have something to do with not and then the rest of the word. something like that. Make sure you look at those roots. It's a good idea to go on Google and just take a look at some common ones to figure out some basic prefixes, some basic suffixes as to what words might mean. Let's take a look at a practice question. Now let's take a look at question type 7, words in context. This one, again, is pretty much a vocabulary question. Take a second and see if you can solve it. Well, the only real one that makes any sense here is going to be B. Discern steps in the evolution of hominids, right? Exploit, prioritize, and yield simply just do not make sense in context, right? The fossil remains of the individual known as OAS1, discovered in Romania in 2002, can help paleoanthropologists not only discern or basically figure out the steps in evolution of hominids, but also illuminate the Pleistocene epoch generally, revealing important details about the time in which OAS1 lived. Question type 8, text structure. Which choice best describes the overall structure of the text, or which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? So you're going to be given a passage with information regarding some sort of idea or topic, or you might be given another one of those poems or old English texts. You're either going to be asked the first question, in which case it'll be some sort of outline in every single answer choice. The outline will say first they introduce new information, then they do something else, and then they whatever, right? They could be, first there's a claim, then there's evidence, then there's a conclusion. Those will all be answer choices. You'll have basically a different outline for the thing for each answer choice. Or you'll have one underlined sentence and it'll ask what's the function of that sentence? What is it doing? Is it providing new information? Is it giving the author's opinion? Is it making a claim? One of those 2 or 3 or 4 different things, right? Now, for both of these types of questions, which is why we kind of combine them here, you're going to simplify every single sentence of the text, right? You're going to write each sentence in your own words, kind of like a bulleted notes, right? You're going to have either an overall structure of the text question or you'll have the single sentence question. For both, just try to find a answer choice that correlates with your outline. For example, if I had an outline and I was looking at sentence 2, in sentence 2 I just wrote down, okay, this has some evidence. And one of the things was, the underlined sentence was sentence 2, and I was asked which choice is best going to describe the function. Well, the function is to give evidence, so I'm just going to look for an answer choice that involves, evidence was given, right? Or for the overall structure of the text question, I'll try to find an answer choice that matches with my outline. Let's take a look at a practice question because this one can be a little bit confusing. Which choice best describes the overall structure of the text? So take a second and see if you can do this on your own. The correct answer is D. We have a philosophy introduced by Lucy Sprague Mitchell, right? And then we have a book. And then the last sentence basically correlates how the book relates to Mitchell's kind of theory. And that is very clearly represented in option D. Our next question type is text purpose. Which choice best describes the main purpose of the text? And a lot of the time, it's just going to be to convince you of something that is true. All right. Similar to the other questions, you'll just be given a passage with some information. You're going to simplify the passage again. You're going to take a look at every sentence. What does it contribute to the text? You may want to use the Notes app feature in Blue Book. Now, one thing you might want to do is identify descriptive words or words of persuasion. If you have a bunch of opinionated words in a text, chances are it's an opinionated piece that's trying to convince you that something is true. And that's probably going to be the answer. Another thing to ask yourself is, who is the author writing for? What is their audience? What do they want to tell that audience, right? You might also want to think about the exigence of that passage. But asking yourself that question is going to reveal the correct answer, and 9 times out of 10. It's possible you might need to reread the passage again, but this strategy, I guarantee you, will reveal the answer pretty quickly. These questions are not too hard. Question 9. Which choice best states the main purpose of the text? Take a second and see if you can answer this on your own. This one is a pretty easy one. Literally every single thing that Dickens says kind of shows how everything is alike. Like one another, like one another, like one another. Same hours, same pavements, same work. To every day was the same, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. This one is pretty clearly A. Everything is uniform. Everything is the same, is like another, is the counterpart of the last and the next. It's a very clear answer. Question type 10 is cross-text connections, and there's a lot of different questions that they can ask here, but some things will always be true, and that is that you'll have 2 texts labeled text 1 and text 2, and there's almost always going to be some common point that the texts agree on, and then 2 or 3 disagreeing points, right? Or it could just be 1 or 2 disagreeing points, depending on how long those passages are. Basically, the question will ask you either what do the authors agree on or what do they disagree on, or how might they respond or reply to each other based on their differing points of view. So here's your strategy. You're going to identify what the topic discussed is. Then you're going to identify what the similarities and differences are, if applicable. Now, if they all agree with everything, that's okay, but that's probably unlikely. You're probably missing a difference, so make sure you just go back and take a look at that again if you can't identify any similarities or if you find that you can't identify any differences. Now, highlight that important info as to which, where they disagree or where they agree, and you can highlight that in different colors. Maybe you choose pink and blue, right? Now you're going to correlate the answer choices. You're going to look at the question and you're going to correlate the answer choices with author thoughts. So let's say like the authors agree on point A, but they disagree on point B. And the question is, based on the text, both authors would likely agree with which statement. And one of those statements, one of those answer choices is, point A. So you're going to be like, okay, well, that makes it pretty easy. I'm just going to correlate my point A. I'm going to look at, which answer choice is point A, and I'm going to put those two together. Let's take a look at a practice question. Let's take a look at question type 10, cross-text connections. Based on the text, how would the author of text 1 most likely respond to the proponents of the philosophical stance outlined in text 2? Take a second and see if you can answer this question. The answer here is going to be D. Moore would assert that external world skepticism is at odds with other beliefs that these proponents must unavoidably hold. Basically, he's just saying that there's common sense. External world skepticism, philosophical stance, supposing that we cannot be sure of the existence of anything outside of our own minds, but Moore would simply say that we can just use common sense. There are certain things that have to be true, no matter whether or not people believe in them. By basically taking this as to be true, Moore would say, okay, well, you're using another thing. You're using some other fact that you hold to be true. Now we're moving on to expression of ideas. Question type 11, transitions. We're almost done. Which choice completes a text with the most logical transition? You have used transitions all your life. In conclusion, similarly, like, though, but, for, every single one of those are all transitions. You're going to be given an informative text on some topic with one of the following. You're either going to be given a multi-clause sentence that requires a transition between the two clauses, or you'll be given 2 sentences that require a transition between them. Here's your strategy. You're going to identify the meaning of the clause that comes first. Then you're going to identify how the second one compares, right? Do they contrast? Do they relate? Do they add to each other? Maybe you use additionally for that. Do they have a cause and effect relationship? Because X, so Y. Or because, something happens and another thing happens. We have a list of transitions for you to use. These are common transitions on the SAT. Again, these are 8 different categorizations that we can put transitions into. We have cause and effect, comparison, contrast, persuasion, illustration, addition, emphasis, and conclusion. All of these transitions could appear on the SAT, and you just basically need to figure out which one is the best one to use in the blank, right? I'm going to do a practice question to kind of explain what I mean a little bit more. Question type 11, transitions. Now we can kind of just go back and look at that transition table that I showed you earlier, but this one's pretty simple. We have 2 different sentences that are contrasting. This one says that we're isolating a pure sample of selenium, and then this one is saying that we have molybdenum. These 2 are contrasting, so therefore our answer must be A. Our second to last question type is rhetorical synthesis. The student wants to do XYZ. Which choice most effectively uses relevant information from the notes to achieve this goal? You're going to be given some background on a topic. It'll say the student has taken these notes on XYZ topic. Then you'll be given some bulleted notes on XYZ topic. The first thing you need to do is determine XYZ. What is the thing that the student is trying to do? Is the student trying to compare 2 novels that are maybe in those bulleted notes? Is the student trying to explain why somebody did XYZ research? Whatever. Here's the thing about this question. This is why this is the easiest question on the SAT. Because a lot of the answer choices have nothing to do with XYZ, right? The student wants to do XYZ. Let's say the student wants to make a claim. 9 times out of 10, 3 out of those 4 options are not even going to be a claim. They're not even going to make any sense at all, right? And you can eliminate those so easily. Just take them out, right? Then you're going to read the bullets. If there are any answer choices left, You're going to read the bullets to determine which one is factually correct, because sometimes they'll try to trip you up to put an answer choice that basically just incorrectly interprets the notes the student took. Question type 12, rhetorical synthesis. I'm going to go into this one a little bit more. So this one says, a student wants to explain an advantage of the new platinum catalyst developed by Jianbao Tang and his colleagues. Which choice most effectively uses relevant information from the notes to accomplish this goal? Now, we want to explain an advantage, and without even reading this, let's just pretend this doesn't exist. Is this an advantage? No, it's not. Is this an advantage? It means a particular amount to be effective? No, that means that, it's a bad thing, really. It's a rare and expensive metal, and it typically requires a lot of platinum. That's also a disadvantage. And so without even reading the problem and knowing literally nothing about platinum, the only option that could possibly be true is D, because it requires far less, right? That's like literally the only one that describes an advantage. And if we go back up here, we can see that that is in fact correct using the advantages, right? Using the notes above. But another reminder that these type of questions, these rhetorical synthesis questions, are often very, very easy because they literally don't even relate a lot of the answer choices to the prompt at hand. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is grammar. Grammar is super important. It's literally like half of the test, so you need to make sure that you have these grammar questions down. Form, structure, and sense, and boundaries. These are the last things that you need to know for your SAT. Which choice completes the text so that it conforms to the conventions of standard English? That is a mouthful. What that means is which one is grammatically correct. You'll be given a short paragraph on a topic with a blank that will be inserted usually where punctuation is necessary, often between clauses. The strategy depends on the situation. You need to know your grammar. There's no getting around it. You need to know your grammar. So we're going to go through all the different types of grammar that could show up. Subject-verb agreement. The key thing that you need to know here is that singular subjects will relate to a singular verb and plural subjects will relate to a plural verb, right? There are several other rules in this slide. You can read through them if you'd like. I'm going to keep moving because that's very, very simple. You just need to have singular subjects, singular verbs, plural subjects, plural verbs. Pronoun antecedent agreement. You do not need to know what an antecedent is. You only need to know that for the ACT, right? But an antecedent is basically just the thing that a pronoun refers to. They must agree in number and gender. So here are a list of different pronouns that you may need to use. If you have a singular antecedent, you must have a singular pronoun. If you have a plural antecedent, you must have a plural pronoun. Plurals and possessives. To form a plural, just add an S. You'll notice here, plural becomes a plural when we have plurals, or possessive becomes a plural when we have possessives. Do not add the apostrophe, right? You should have students without the apostrophe. Student becomes students. GPA becomes GPAs. 4.0 becomes 4.0s. You are not adding an apostrophe when you make that into a plural. But when we have a possessive, when a noun owns something, for example, he read the student's books. The books belong to this student, right? So you add the apostrophe. He read the students' books, right? Here, students is plural, right? He's basically saying, if I have a collection of students and I'm reading their books, right? Make sure you add the apostrophe when it's a possessive. You do not add it when it's a plural. Verb forms. Make sure your verbs are in the correct tense. If you have a sentence, which will be given to you on the SAT, and every single verb is in present tense, do not choose the verb that is in past tense. Choose the verb that is also in present tense, right? It's very simple. Make sure you maintain the verb tense throughout the paragraph. Subject modifier placement. Very, very easy. Subjects and modifiers must be next to each other. So a modifier is basically something that describes a subject. So let's take a look at this example. In the correct one, we have old and withered. The tree was a constant force of nature. Old and withered is describing the tree. Therefore, when we have the tree, that part must be right next to, physically next to in the sentence, old and withered. Old and withered, a constant force of nature was the tree, sounds like Yoda. It's wrong. You need to not sound like Yoda. You need to have all of your stuff needs to be next to each other. If you have a modifier, it has to be next to the subject. All right, question type 13A, form, structure, and sense. See if you can take a look at this. All right, so I've already written our little sentence down here without any punctuation whatsoever. Let's take a look at this and see if it makes any sense. After the colonies achieved their independence, Paine moved to France where the provocative author's political writings would contribute to another revolution, the French Revolution. Well, we can already see it. There are not multiple authors, right? There is only one author, and the political writings belong to that author. Therefore, we should have a little bit of possession going on, which means that we need to have an apostrophe here, right? The provocative author's political writings, plural, would contribute to another revolution. Now, we don't need to add an apostrophe here because it's just pluralized. This is not showing any possession here. Only this one is showing any possession. Therefore, let's take a look at and see which one correlates with this right here, and we notice that it is choice B. Linking clauses. What is an independent clause? What is a dependent clause? Well, a clause to begin with is just a building block of a sentence that involves a subject and a verb. Independent clauses can be sentences on their own. Dependent clauses can't. So the man had experience could be a sentence on its own, but because he had worked in the industry for years can't, because it starts with because and it's not really explaining what that because is to, right? Just like thinking about that in your head. If I just said because he had worked in the industry for years, that sentence is missing something, right? It just doesn't make sense. Now, how do we link these clauses together? Well, let's say we have two independent clauses, right? We're going to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, that is the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So let's have an example here. It wasn't the best work. That could be an independent clause. Yet, it was an improvement over last time. That could also be an independent clause. It was an improvement over last time is something that makes sense. We have a subject, and we're good, right? So we're going to use a coordinating conjunction there. We're going to use yet, and we're going to use a comma. That makes sense. Now, semicolons and periods can also link independent clauses. For example, he was old, semicolon. He'd been on this earth for 80 years, right? Those two things could also be standalone independent clauses, but we're going to link them with a semicolon. Linking independent and dependent clauses. We're going to use a subordinating conjunction. Although, since, when, because, while, or after. There are many other subordinating conjunctions, but unlike the fanboys, it's not like a specific list of them. We're also going to use a comma if the dependent clause comes first. So because he was old, again, we have another one of those dependent clauses that starts with because, he had experience. We have a comma there because the dependent clause comes first. Or if we kind of switch that around, we put the dependent clause second, we won't need that comma, right? He had experience because he was old. Supplements. When an essential element is removed from a sentence, the sentence no longer conveys the same meaning. When a non-essential element is removed, the sentence conveys relatively the same meaning. So an essential element is something that basically will ruin the sentence if you don't have it in there. Whereas a non-essential element will not ruin the sentence if you don't have that in there. How do you indicate, what is a non-essential element and when should we use them? Well, I'm going to take out my laser pointer here real quick. If we have a parentheses, we can use that. We can have a comma, or we can have an em dash. So John Smith, a famous archaeologist, had just made a new discovery. This information is not necessary. We could just say John Smith had made a new discovery, right? That is non-essential information. We can also use commas and em dashes to offset that information to indicate that it is non-essential. Now, let's say that instead we had an essential element. An essential element will be John Smith, right? If we just say a famous archaeologist had just made a new discovery, that tells us almost nothing, right? That doesn't tell us who actually made that discovery. There are plenty of famous archaeologists. Now, here, the subject, John Smith, and the action is preserved when the information is removed, right? That just makes sense. It still makes sense when the non-essential element is removed. Now, one important thing to note, we do not mix punctuation, right? If I had, let's say, I take out my laser pointer again, if I had a parentheses here, and then we had a comma here, that would not make any sense, right? We would need a closed parentheses. Or if we had a dash here and a comma here, that would not make sense. When we are trying to offset non-essential elements, we need to use the same punctuation on both sides of the non-essential element. Punctuation, this is like our last slide here, right? Commas. What do? You can use them to list items, you can use them to separate those non-essential elements, you can use them to link dependent and independent clauses, or independent clauses with a fanboy. Now, semicolons, you can link independent clauses using those, or you can separate complex list items. We didn't really talk about this, but let's say I have a list, and that list has items with commas in it. Let's say Paris, France, Rome, Italy, New York City, United States. If I'd use commas in that list for everything instead of semicolons, it wouldn't make any sense. It would be like a list saying Paris, France, Rome, Italy, New York City, United States. But we're thinking about specific places. Paris, France, Rome, Italy, New York City, United States. If we didn't have those semicolons, it'd be very confusing, right, as to which one we're talking about. Are we talking about Paris? Are we talking about France? Are we talking about them as independent entities or as one specific entity, right? Anytime you have a list that already contains commas, just use semicolons to offset each item. Colons, those come at the end of an independent clause to either explain something that preceded it or to list something. So, for example, he couldn't make a cake for one reason. He had no flour. The text that comes after the colon explains why he couldn't make that cake. Or for the list, there are 3 good types of ice cream: cookies and cream, vanilla, and chocolate fudge, right? You have a list after the colon. Dashes are used, as we mentioned previously, to separate non-essential elements. And that, after we do our last practice question, is the end of the full SAT English review. Our last question is a boundaries question. See if you can look at this one yourself quickly. Here we have a non-essential element question, right? The study of fungi, which has to go here, right? It has to go fungi and then some sort of producing. Well, the study of fungi with this mycology thing is actually a non-essential element, which means that because we have a comma offsetting it here, we have another comma offsetting it here. The only option with that choice is D.